My best friend wanted me to pick up his daughter from kindergarten, but the child who got into my car was definitely not his kid. The substitute teacher at Ridgewood Elementary shoved this hollow-eyed girl toward my Honda Civic, checking her clipboard twice before nodding. "Here's Sophia for you, Mr. Brennan." But I'd been picking up Mike Castillo's daughter every Thursday for 6 months. This wasn't her. This child had Sophia's dark hair and wore her Batman backpack. But when she climbed into my car, she moved like an old woman pretending to be 5 years old. Real Sophia bounced everywhere, chattering non-stop about playground drama and art projects. This girl sat perfectly still, hands folded, staring at nothing. "How was school today, sweetheart?" I asked, watching her in the rearview mirror. She tilted her head like she was translating my words from another language. After 10 seconds of silence, she whispered, "School was educational. I learned appropriate behaviors." The formal phrasing made my skin crawl. Real Sophia would have already told me that Jeremy ate glue again, and Mrs. Patterson's wig looked funny when she bent over. I pulled over immediately and turned around to study her face. Same olive skin, same brown eyes, same small mole near her left ear. But Sophia had chipped her front tooth last month when she fell off the monkey bars. This child's teeth were perfect, straight, unmarked. My hands started shaking as I realized I was either looking at Sophia's identical twin or staring at evidence of something horrific. "What's your favorite animal?" I tested her, knowing Sophia had been obsessed with dolphins since her 3rd birthday. She had dolphin pajamas, dolphin toys, and could recite dolphin facts for hours. This child processed the question for several seconds before responding. "I like all animals because they teach us about nature." The answer sounded like something from an educational video, not from a kindergartner's genuine enthusiasm. Instead of driving to Mike's house, I parked outside a McDonald's and called his cell phone. It went straight to voicemail, which was strange because Mike always answered when I was handling pickup duty. The child didn't react to hearing her supposed father's voice on the recording. She just continued staring forward with those empty, medicated eyes that made me think of psychiatric patients. "Sophia, do you remember when we went to the beach last month?" I asked, referring to a family trip where she'd spent 3 hours building sandcastles and squealing every time waves touched her feet. This child looked confused, like I'd asked her to solve calculus. "I don't remember beaches," she said finally, "but I would like to learn about them because learning is important." I drove to Mike's house on Elm Street, my mind racing through impossible explanations. Maybe Sophia was sick, and Mike had asked a cousin to impersonate her so the school wouldn't worry. Maybe this was some elaborate test of my observational skills. But when I pulled into the driveway, Mike's red Toyota wasn't there, even though he'd specifically told me he'd be home early today to surprise Sophia with a new bike. The child got out of my car and walked to the front door with mechanical precision, like she'd practiced this exact routine hundreds of times. She didn't run ahead or dawdle to examine bugs on the sidewalk like real Sophia always did. She just moved forward at a steady pace, her small hands swinging at perfectly measured intervals. Carmen Castillo opened the door before we could knock, and I watched her face carefully as she looked at the child. For a split second, her expression showed confusion and something that looked like fear. Then she forced a bright smile and said, "There's my little princess. How was school today, baby?" But her voice cracked slightly on the endearment, and she kept glancing nervously over the child's head to scan the street behind us. "I was good today, Mommy," the child replied in that same formal tone. I followed all instructions and made no disturbances. Carmen's smile wavered at the phrasing, and she stepped back to let us into the house. Inside their familiar living room, everything looked normal except for small details that felt wrong. Sophia's artwork on the refrigerator had been replaced with precise, colorless drawings that looked like technical diagrams rather than a child's creative expression. "Where's Mike?" I asked Carmen directly. She was bustling around the kitchen, opening and closing cabinets like she'd forgotten where everything belonged. "Oh, he got called into work unexpectedly. You know how the construction business is." But Mike had sent me a text that morning specifically saying he was taking the afternoon off to spend time with Sophia. The timeline didn't match, and Carmen's nervous energy suggested she was lying about something significant. I noticed the child was watching our conversation with unusual intensity, like she was taking mental notes about how adults interacted. Real Sophia would have been pestering us for snacks or asking to watch cartoons. This girl just sat at the kitchen table, posture perfect, hands still folded in her lap, like she was awaiting further instructions. "Carmen, can I use your bathroom?" I asked, but instead of going upstairs, I slipped down to the basement. What I found there made me understand that whatever was happening in this house was far worse than a simple case of mistaken identity. The finished basement had been converted into what looked like a medical examination room, combined with a classroom for very young children. Hospital-grade equipment filled one corner. IV stands, medication refrigerators, and monitoring devices that seemed too sophisticated for a residential basement. The opposite wall was covered with behavioral charts, reward systems, and what appeared to be lesson plans for teaching basic human responses. Week 3, practice expressing happiness. Week 4, appropriate family interactions. Week 5, memory integration protocols. A locked filing cabinet contained medical records for someone named Subject 23, documenting a systematic program of psychological conditioning. The records described daily drug treatments, behavioral modification sessions, and something called identity integration therapy. One report noted, subjects showing excellent progress in personality suppression, original memories successfully fragmented, ready for family placement within 2 weeks. Behind a false wall, I discovered what could only be described as a dormitory for very small children. 4 beds with built-in restraints, each accompanied by a plastic storage container filled with identical clothes in different sizes. A white board displayed a schedule: 6 now a.m., medication; 7 now a.m., identity reinforcement; 8 now a.m., behavioral conditioning; 9 now a.m., family roleplay. The most horrifying discovery was a video monitoring system with cameras focused on each bed and dozens of recorded sessions. I watched in sick fascination as therapists worked with children who clearly weren't their original selves anymore, coaching them to respond to names that weren't theirs and to love families who had purchased them like merchandise. One video file was labeled Sophia Integration, Final Phase. I clicked play and watched the child from upstairs being coached by a woman in medical scrubs. Remember, you love your daddy more than anyone in the world. Your favorite food is pizza. Your favorite color is purple. You've lived in this house your whole life. The child repeated these facts mechanically, while electrodes attached to her head monitored her brain activity. I photographed everything with my phone, my hands shaking with rage and horror. This wasn't just child abduction. This was systematic psychological torture designed to erase children's identities and replace them with artificial personalities. The scope of what I was seeing suggested an operation that had been running for years, processing dozens of stolen children. Footsteps on the basement stairs forced me to hide behind the equipment. Carmen's voice drifted down. Dr. Webb wants to schedule another conditioning session tomorrow. The integration isn't holding as well as we'd hoped. A man's voice I didn't recognize responded. The original personality is stronger than we anticipated. We may need more aggressive pharmaceutical intervention. I waited until they left before creeping back upstairs, where I found the child exactly where I'd left her, sitting motionless at the kitchen table like a robot awaiting activation. Carmen was on the phone in the next room, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Yes, he's here. No, I don't think he suspects anything yet, but we might need to accelerate the timeline. Sophia, do you want to play outside? I asked the child, testing her responses. Real Sophia loved being outdoors and would have immediately started planning an adventure. This girl looked uncertain, like she was consulting an internal manual. I should ask Mommy for permission first, she said. Good children always ask permission before playing. That evening, I called my brother Luke, who worked as a detective with the state police. I described what I'd witnessed, and the silence on his end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, he said, David, what you're describing sounds like something from a horror movie. Are you absolutely certain about what you saw? When I sent him the photos from Mike's basement, his tone changed immediately. Don't go back there. I'm contacting the FBI tonight. Luke connected me with Agent Rebecca Torres, who specialized in organized trafficking operations. When I walked her through my evidence, she asked me to come in immediately for a formal debriefing. Mr. Brennan, what you've uncovered matches intelligence we've been gathering about a sophisticated child replacement network. We've been trying to locate their conditioning facilities for 8 months. Agent Torres explained that the operation was unlike typical trafficking rings. These children aren't being sold into traditional forms of exploitation. They're being psychologically conditioned to become perfect replacements for children that wealthy families have lost. The buyers pay enormous sums because they believe they're purchasing guaranteed love and obedience. The clinical way she described it made my stomach turn. The FBI had been tracking missing children cases across 7 states where kids had vanished from secure locations, schools, daycare centers, family events, with no witnesses and no evidence of struggle. The perpetrators are incredibly sophisticated. They identify targets, study their behavior patterns, and then abduct them from locations where replacement would be possible. Your friend's house appears to be one of many integration sites. How many children are we talking about? I asked, thinking about the equipment I'd seen and the video files suggesting this had been going on for years. Agent Torres pulled out a thick file folder. Based on our intelligence, possibly over 200 children in the past 4 years. The network operates facilities in Nevada, Colorado, Oregon, and now apparently here. They're expanding rapidly because demand from grieving parents keeps growing. She showed me photographs of missing children from across the western United States, all between ages 4 and 8, all with physical characteristics that would make them suitable for replacing specific deceased children. The kidnappers work with corrupt medical professionals who can alter the children's appearances through minor surgical procedures, dental work, and pharmaceutical interventions. By the time the conditioning is complete, even biological parents might not recognize their own kids. The plan was for me to return to Mike's house wearing a wire, while FBI agents positioned themselves around the neighborhood. We need evidence of the child's true identity and documentation of how the conditioning process works. Can you handle that without alerting them to what you know? I wasn't sure, but I knew that child, and possibly dozens of others, would never be saved if I didn't try. 2 days later, I arrived at Mike and Carmen's house with recording equipment hidden in my jacket. The same hollow-eyed child answered the door, but this time she was wearing a different outfit, a yellow dress that looked expensive and completely unused. "Hello, Mr. Brennan," she said with programmed politeness. "Mommy and Daddy are expecting you." Mike was home this time, but he looked like he'd aged a decade since I'd last seen him. His face was gaunt, his hands shaky, and he kept glancing nervously toward the basement door. When he hugged the child, there was no warmth in the interaction, just the mechanical performance of affection between two people playing assigned roles. "David, thanks for coming by," Mike said, but his voice sounded strained and unnatural. "Sophia has been looking forward to seeing you." The child nodded obediently, but her expression remained blank. Real Sophia would have been bouncing with excitement, demanding attention, and asking 100 questions about why I was there. I asked to speak with Mike privately in his garage, where I confronted him directly. "Mike, that's not Sophia. Where is your real daughter?" His composure cracked immediately, and he started crying like a broken man. "David, she's gone. Our Sophia died in a car accident 9 months ago. We couldn't live with losing her." The story came out in broken fragments between his sobs. Real Sophia had been killed when a drunk driver ran a red light while Carmen was driving her to dance class. The other driver had been wealthy enough to make the criminal charges disappear, leaving Mike and Carmen with nothing but grief and rage. We were going to get divorced. Carmen was having a breakdown. Then Dr. Nathan Webb contacted us. Dr. Webb ran what he called a family reconstruction service, a network that provided replacement children to families who had lost kids to tragedy. For $300,000, he could supply them with a child who would be everything their dead daughter had been, but better, more obedient, more grateful, and incapable of the kind of accident that had destroyed their lives. The child we have now started out as Isabella Reyes, a 5-year-old from Phoenix whose parents were illegal immigrants, Mike explained, his voice hollow with self-disgust. Dr. Webb's people took her from a daycare center and spent 4 months erasing her memories, her personality, everything that made her who she was. Then they programmed her to be Sophia. The process involved experimental drugs that suppressed memory formation, psychological torture techniques adapted from military interrogation programs, and behavioral conditioning that turned stolen children into blank slates who could be loaded with new identities. They showed us videos of the progress, Mike continued. Week by week, Isabella disappeared and Sophia emerged. By the end, she genuinely believed she was our daughter. Carmen appeared in the garage doorway, having overheard parts of our conversation. "You don't understand what it's like to lose a child," she said, her voice defensive but breaking. "We weren't hurting Isabella. We were saving her from poverty and giving her a better life." Dr. Webb explained that she'd be happier as Sophia than she ever could have been as herself. I asked how many other families were involved in Dr. Webb's network. Carmen showed me a private website that looked like a catalog for purchasing pets, with photographs of children arranged by age, hair color, and temperament. Descriptions included their conditioning progress and integration potential. Prices ranged from $200,000 for basic personality replacement to $400,000 for complete identity reconstruction with enhanced compliance features. "There are maybe 60 families like us," Mike said, "all people who lost children and couldn't handle the grief. Dr. Webb provides what he calls perfect children, kids who will never rebel, never leave home, never break your heart the way real children sometimes do." The casual way he described purchasing a human being's personality made me want to vomit. Carmen pulled out medical records documenting Isabella's transformation into Sophia. The clinical language described psychological torture as therapeutic intervention. Subject shows excellent response to memory fragmentation protocols. Identity integration proceeding ahead of schedule. Recommend maintenance conditioning every 6 months to prevent personality regression. "But she's happy now," Carmen insisted, even as tears streamed down her face. "She doesn't remember her biological parents. She doesn't miss her old life. We're the only family she knows, and she loves us." The rationalization was sickening, but I could see how desperate parents might convince themselves that erasing a child's identity was somehow merciful. I asked what happened to the children who couldn't be successfully conditioned. Mike's expression darkened. Dr. Webb calls them processing failures. Some kids resist the treatment and never fully integrate their new identities. Those children get transferred to different facilities for alternative placement. The euphemism was chilling, and I didn't want to think about what alternative placement might mean for a child who couldn't be sold as a family pet. The next phase of my investigation involved meeting Dr. Webb himself. Mike arranged an appointment under the pretense that Sophia was showing signs of personality regression and needed maintenance conditioning. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m. at a facility called the Bright Futures Family Therapy Center on the outskirts of town. Agent Torres briefed me on Dr. Webb's background, while FBI technicians fitted me with more sophisticated recording equipment. Nathan Webb is a former military psychiatrist who was court-martialed for conducting unauthorized psychological experiments on prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. He disappeared from government custody 5 years ago and apparently started this private operation using techniques he developed for breaking enemy combatants. The Bright Futures facility looked like a typical medical building from the outside, but the interior was divided between a public area designed to look like a children's therapy center and a restricted section that housed the actual conditioning equipment. Dr. Webb was a soft-spoken man in his 50s who discussed children's psychological modification with the clinical detachment of a scientist describing lab experiments. Isabella's integration metrics have been excellent, he told Mike and Carmen, reviewing behavioral charts that tracked the child's responses to various stimuli. However, we're detecting some fragmentation in her identity matrix. Original personality fragments are beginning to resurface, which could compromise her effectiveness as Sophia. He recommended immediate intervention to prevent what he called identity regression syndrome. I watched in horror as they led the child, Isabella, not Sophia, into an examination room where technicians prepared to inject her with drugs that would reinforce her artificial memories while suppressing any remaining traces of her original self. She didn't resist or show fear, just submitted to the procedure with the same mechanical compliance she'd shown all week. Dr. Webb explained his philosophy while preparing the injection. Traditional adoption is flawed because it doesn't address the core problem of children having independent personalities that may conflict with their parents' needs. Our process creates genuinely grateful children who exist solely to love their families. They have no external loyalties, no conflicting memories, no desire to be anywhere else. The casual evil in his voice made me understand how people could rationalize systematic psychological torture. In Dr. Webb's worldview, erasing a child's identity wasn't abuse. It was providing a superior product to grieving customers who deserved guaranteed happiness after suffering loss. The children's humanity was simply an obstacle to be overcome through proper conditioning. At 2:47 p.m., Agent Torres gave the signal for simultaneous raids on all known Webb facilities. FBI agents stormed the building where Isabella was about to receive another round of identity-suppressing drugs, arresting Dr. Webb with syringes full of experimental chemicals in his hands. The timing was critical. Another few minutes, and the child might have lost more fragments of her original personality. The raids uncovered 63 children in various stages of conditioning across 4 states. Some had been recently kidnapped and still remembered their real names. Others had been completely transformed and no longer showed any recognition when presented with photos of their biological families. The youngest victim was 3 years old, stolen from a grocery store in Denver. The oldest was a 10-year-old boy who had been missing for 18 months and now answered only to the name his buyer family had chosen. Dr. Webb's computer files revealed the full scope of his operation. 156 children kidnapped and conditioned over 5 years, sold to 98 families across 15 states. The buyers included celebrities, politicians, business executives, and even some medical professionals who had lost children and were desperate enough to purchase replacements. Revenue records showed the network had generated over $45 million from selling stolen children's identities. The arrest of the buyer families created a complex crisis as law enforcement struggled with what to do with children who had been psychologically programmed to love their kidnappers. Many of these kids became hysterical when separated from the families who had purchased them, genuinely believing they belonged with people who had erased their original identities. Child psychologists debated whether forced reunification with biological families would cause additional trauma. Isabella's case became the most closely monitored because her conditioning had been so recent and complete. When her biological parents, Maria and Carlos Reyes, were brought to the FBI field office, she didn't recognize them and cowered behind Carmen Castillo, begging not to be taken away from her real mommy. The scene broke everyone's hearts, especially the Reyes family, who had spent 9 months searching for their missing daughter. Dr. Jennifer Kim, a specialist in cult deprogramming, was brought in to coordinate the children's psychological recovery. She explained that undoing the conditioning would be an experimental process that might take years and might never fully succeed. These children have had their core personalities systematically destroyed and replaced with artificial identities. We're essentially trying to resurrect parts of their psyche that may have been permanently damaged. The legal proceedings against Dr. Webb and his network lasted 2 years, with testimony from medical experts, recovered children, and the buyer families who had participated in the conspiracy. The most powerful testimony came from some of the older children who had begun recovering fragments of their original memories and could describe the conditioning process from a victim's perspective. One 13-year-old boy described being strapped to a table while doctors showed him photographs of his new family and administered electric shocks until he agreed that he loved them more than his biological parents. A 9-year-old girl testified about being forced to repeat her new identity information hundreds of times each day until she couldn't remember her original name. Their accounts revealed the systematic cruelty involved in erasing human personality. Mike and Carmen Castillo were sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for child trafficking and conspiracy. During their sentencing hearing, Mike read a statement acknowledging that their grief over losing Sophia had led them to participate in destroying an innocent child's identity. We told ourselves we were saving Isabella from poverty and giving her a loving home, but we were really torturing her to satisfy our own emotional needs. Dr. Webb received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, along with 47 other medical professionals who had participated in the conditioning network. The judge described their crimes as systematic psychological torture of children on an industrial scale, and noted that the long-term damage to victims might never be fully understood or reversible. Isabella's recovery became a case study in treating victims of identity conditioning. The drugs she had been given caused permanent changes to her brain chemistry, leaving her with memory disorders and emotional regulation problems that would require lifelong treatment. But gradually, with intensive therapy and the patient support of her biological parents, fragments of her original personality began to emerge. The process was slower and more complex than anyone had anticipated. Some days, Isabella would remember her real name and ask to see her abuela in Phoenix. Other days, she would cry for Carmen and Mike, the people her conditioned mind still considered her true parents. Her therapists had to help her understand that both sets of feelings were real, even though one had been artificially created through torture. 3 years after the rescue, Isabella still struggles with identity confusion and occasionally experiences what Dr. R. Kim calls personality fragmentation episodes, where her artificial Sophia identity temporarily resurfaces. Her biological parents have learned to be patient with these episodes, understanding that their daughter is recovering from a form of psychological warfare that few people have ever survived. The broader impact of Operation Empty Cradle led to federal legislation requiring stricter oversight of private adoption agencies and therapeutic facilities that work with children. A new task force was created specifically to investigate child trafficking networks that use psychological conditioning, with Dr. Kim serving as the lead consultant on deprogramming techniques. Not all of the recovered children were able to reunite successfully with their biological families. Some had been missing so long that their original families had moved away, or couldn't handle the psychological complexity of a child who had been programmed to love someone else. These kids entered specialized foster care programs designed to help them build new identities without the trauma of forced memory recovery. The investigation also revealed a secondary network of medical professionals who had been developing even more advanced conditioning techniques. Dr. Webb's operation was apparently just one branch of a larger conspiracy involving research into pharmaceutical mind control, genetic modification of children's brain chemistry, and experimental surgery to alter personality traits. The full scope of these programs is still being investigated by federal agencies. Luke helped me understand that my role in exposing the network had probably prevented hundreds of additional kidnappings and saved countless children from psychological torture. But that knowledge didn't make it easier to live with what I'd witnessed. Some nights, I still wake up thinking about all the children who are probably still out there, stolen from their families, and being systematically erased by people who believe love can be programmed like software. 4 years later, I work with the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children, helping train law enforcement officers to recognize signs of identity conditioning in recovered trafficking victims. The work is emotionally devastating because most people can't believe that such systematic evil exists in communities that appear perfectly normal from the outside. Isabella is now 9 years old and has recovered enough of her original personality to attend regular school with accommodations for her learning disabilities. She still sees Dr. Kim twice a week, and probably always will, but she's learned to live with the fact that parts of her childhood will always be missing. Her parents have become advocates for other families dealing with recovered conditioning victims. The last time I saw Isabella, she was playing soccer with her younger brother, who was born after her rescue. She ran and laughed and argued about the rules like any normal kid, but sometimes she would stop mid-game and stare into space, accessing memories that belonged to the artificial child she used to be. Those moments reminded everyone that recovery from psychological torture is never complete. Mike Castillo was released from prison last year and now works with a non-profit organization that helps parents cope with child loss without turning to illegal solutions. He speaks at grief counseling sessions about how desperate love can become monstrous when it's not properly supported. His marriage to Carmen didn't survive the prison sentences, but they both continue therapy to understand how their pain led them to participate in destroying another family. Recovery is possible, but it's never complete, and it never comes without cost. Isabella will carry the scars of her conditioning forever, hidden beneath the surface of what looks like a normal childhood. But for her and the other survivors, that partial healing represents a victory over a system designed to erase them entirely. They exist. They remember fragments of who they used to be, and they're learning to build authentic identities from the broken pieces of their stolen selves. Sometimes, in a world where children can be purchased and programmed like products, that's the only victory available.